Bishkek's upcoming assumption of the chairmanship functions in the SCO from September 2025. Serious attention will be paid to the issues of regional security in Central Asia, including building up joint efforts to counter threats emanating from international extremist and terrorist forces, and attempts to destabilize the region from the outside. And as part of his official visit to Kyrgyzstan, the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov will also take part in a regular meeting of the Council of Foreign Ministers of the Collective Security Treaty Organization, which will also be held in Cholpon-Ata under the chairmanship of the Kyrgyz Republic. The heads of the foreign policy agencies of the organization's member states will exchange views on the state of international regional situation and discuss the prospects for further development of cooperation within the CSTO, as well as the progress for preparation for the next session of the Collective Security Council in the fourth quarter of this year. Following the meeting, the adoption of a number of joint political statements is expected. Now moving on to relevant international agenda, we have a great deal of issues and requests for comments regarding the situation in Iran and Israel. I would like to point out that today the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov will or already gave a response to the relevant question during a press conference following his meeting with his Lao counterpart. But summing up the issues and the questions that we receive, I would like to say that we welcome the messages about the readiness of Iran and Israel to comply with the ceasefire, and we now have hope that the escalation which started on June 13 this year by the aggressive illegal actions of Israel against Iran, which were joined by the United States on the 22nd of June this year, will be stopped. From the very beginning of the hot stage of the conflict, Russia, together with the overwhelming majority of the international community, has persistently called for this. The attempt undertaken by by Jerusalem and by Washington to use brute force to limit Iran's legitimate rights to a civilian nuclear program has quite predictably caused the deepest concern in the world. This is evidenced by the series of emergency meetings by the UN Security Council and the IAEA Board of Governors held in the last 2 weeks. It is important to emphasize that this is not only about unprovoked aggression against the sovereign states, but also about undermining the global regime of nuclear non-proliferation, the foundation of which is the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT. The fact that the Iranian nuclear facilities, which are under control of the IAEA, have become a target for American and Israeli missiles is an undisguised challenge to the NPT system. Real obstacles have arisen for the implementation of the Comprehensive Safeguards Agreement concluded between the agency and the Islamic Republic of Iran. The credibility of the global verification system of the agency, which was used as a source of information for planning bombings, is in question. It is the US and Israel that bear responsibility for the colossal damage to the IAEA's activities, no matter how much they try to blame Tehran for all sins. It is unacceptable for the bombing of nuclear facilities to become commonplace. And unfortunately, directly and indirectly, this is exactly how the Western media are trying to show the situation. An objective assessment of what has happened is required so that such a thing never happens again. The truth is that the actions of Israel and the United States were illegal from the very beginning, contradicting the UN Charter and the resolutions of the Security Council, which, let me remind you, unequivocally qualified attacks on nuclear installations as unacceptable. Attempts to justify the attacks with imaginary threats which supposedly emanate from the Iranian nuclear program are absolutely unacceptable, which is confirmed by the repeated statements of the IAEA leadership about the absence of signs, let me emphasize signs, of military and nuclear activity in Iran. We expect that the agency will not deviate from these assessments for opportunistic reasons or under pressure from individual countries. It is important to preserve and consolidate the fragile truce in order to return the situation to the negotiating track as soon as possible. A settlement around the Iranian nuclear program, as well as the resolution of other crises in the Middle East, can only be achieved through diplomacy and negotiations. There is no reasonable alternative to this. Our country will continue to provide all possible assistance to this process, which was confirmed during the meeting of the President of the Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin, with the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Iran. Let me remind you, the meeting took place in Moscow on the 23rd of June. On the table, we still have the concrete practical initiatives put forward by the President of Russia aimed at finding mutually acceptable solutions. They have been brought to the attention of all parties involved, the US, Israel, and Iran. At the same time, we are not imposing anything on anyone, I mean Russia. We're just talking about how we see a possible way out of the situation, which would presuppose on one hand ensuring Iran's legitimate right to develop a peaceful atom, and on the other hand would take into account security interests of Israel. We believe that finding such a way out is realistic. All of these days, there's been a great deal of work done to help the Russian compatriots, the Russian citizens, and many of those who have other citizenships who addressed our embassies abroad, and the Russian diplomats provided them with the necessary assistance. In the context of the escalating tensions in the Middle East, the relevant departments of the Foreign Ministry and other agencies, embassies, air carriers, and tour companies are continuing their coordinated work to ensure the evacuation of our citizens from dangerous regions. In total, since June 14 this year, the evacuation of more than 1,000 people has been organized. Family members of the employees of Russian missions abroad, delegations, artistic groups, personnel of economic operators, our tourists and compatriots. About 800 or 900 people have left Iran. Of course, the figures will become more precise. Routes have been worked out through border crossings to Azerbaijan, the Astara checkpoint, Armenia, Agorak checkpoint, and Turkmenistan through the Bajigiran checkpoint. Applications are being processed, and over 130 Russians have been provided assistance in leaving Israel via Egypt and Jordan through the Sheikh Hussein Bridge, including families with seriously ill children. 85 people have left Iraq. The priority is to ensure the safe evacuation of our citizens. The corresponding work is ongoing. As you understand, we are grateful to the authorities of Iran, Israel, Azerbaijan, Armenia, Egypt, Jordan, Iraq, and Turkmenistan for their assistance. We call on our citizens to continue to exercise maximum caution and observe personal security measures, taking into account the dynamic changes in the military and political situation in the region, the situation in the airspace of Iran, Israel, and other countries, and the possibility of resuming direct flights to Russia. We ask you to follow the messages and warnings of Russian missions abroad, airlines, and tour operators. Links to contact information will be provided in the text version of this briefing. We have taken note of the fact that a number of Western politicians and other public figures these days started talking about creating a nuclear weapon-free zone in the Middle East, and even many experts and reviewers said that the illegal bombings of Iran were part of the efforts to create a WMD-free zone in the Middle East. You know, I would like to clarify the wording and remind you of the history of the matter. In particular, in an interview with NBC on June 22, the US Vice President J.D. Vance spoke out against the proliferation of nuclear weapons in the Middle East. I would like to once again emphasize that many politicians provided their own visions and interpretations of this term these days. The thought is correct, but we note that consistency is important in this matter. We recall that the US, along with Russia and the UK, are co-sponsors of the resolution on the creation of a zone free of weapons of mass destruction and their means of delivery in the Middle East. Let me remind you that this was adopted at the 1995 Conference on the Review and Extension of the Treaty on Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons. At the same time, the US has become too carried away with promoting the postulate that Iran, and Iran in particular, should not have nuclear weapons, and has forgotten that Israel should not have such weapons either, in equal measures according to international law. The situation with the recent strikes by Israel and the US on nuclear facilities in Iran, civilian sites, let me remind you, which were carried out under a contrived pretext, inevitably brings the issue of Israel's nuclear potential back to the agenda and makes the topic of creating a WMD-free zone in the Middle East even more relevant. For many years, difficult but intensive discussions, let me remind you, for decades, the discussions have been held on this matter. And in these discussions, the states of the Middle East region play a major role. The only country that stubbornly evades all discussions and meetings is Israel. On the one hand, it extols the high ideals of nuclear non-proliferation, and on the other hand, it reduces everything to imaginary threats allegedly emanating from Iran, clearly not wanting to bind itself with any obligations in the field of nuclear non-proliferation. It does not sign the NPT and does not place all its nuclear activities under the control of the IAEA, and the US panders to it in this. At the same time, West Jerusalem considers it possible to use the obligations of the non-nuclear weapon states parties to the NPT as a lever of pressure on them, a tool for settling political scores, and even a pretext for starting its own military operations, as we have seen now. This is a mistake, at least, an opportunistic policy, which is based on illegal foundations. We are convinced that the efforts to create a WMD-free zone in the Middle East must continue. We see a desire for this from the Arab states and Iran. Let me remind you on whose initiative, Iran's initiative, jointly with Egypt. Back in 1974, a UN General Assembly resolution, creation of a zone free of nuclear weapons in the region of the Middle East, was adopted. West Jerusalem has no objective reasons to ignore this responsible process, which also meets its national interests. Starting from 2018, 5 sessions of the conference, convened annually, with the exception of the COVID 2020, have been held on the WMD-free zone in the Middle East. The next round will take place in November this year in New York. This platform has created the most comfortable conditions for all states of the region, including Israel, to be able to participate in the discussion and continue to contribute to the creation of a corresponding security architecture. The longer West Jerusalem sabotages these efforts, the stronger the pressure on it, and its isolation in the region will be, with all the related negative consequences. Let me remind you once again that starting from 2018, there have been 5 sessions convened annually of the conference on the issue of the WMD-free zone in the Middle East. And as we refer to this topic, we should be well aware of the history of the matter, which has already been codified in international law. This is more than just a discussion. This is practical work of the states in the international legal field. Now moving back to the situation around Ukraine. The neo-Nazi Kiev regime continues terrorist attacks against the civilian population and civilian infrastructure of Russia. Over the past week, 114 civilians have suffered from the shellings by the Nazis. 13 people were killed, including 2 minors, and 101 people were injured. If I may, I will provide just a few facts to put these figures into context, not to sound just as dull statistics. Let's look deeper into these tragedies. The Belgrade region, on June 17, in Grevoron, near a pharmacy, 3 female residents were injured by a Ukrainian drone strike. On June 18, in Shebekine, a man was blown up by a cluster of submunition while mowing grass. On June 22, on the Razova-Borki section of the road, 2 civilians, including a 16-year-old teenager, were wounded by a Ukrainian drone strike. In the village of Zhevka, an enemy drone attacked an ambulance. They aimed specifically at an ambulance, not just the civilian side, injuring the medical team, a doctor, a paramedic, and a driver. In the Bryansk region, on June 21, in the village of Masnova, 2 employees of the fire department were injured as a result of a Ukrainian drone strike. Not just civilians, they were firefighters, a service that is meant to help the people in emergencies. Kursk region, on June 17, 2 local residents were killed as a result of a shelling by the armed forces of Ukraine from a multiple launch rocket system in the village of Zvane. On the same day, in the village of Kornevo, a Ukrainian drone attack on a civilian car led to the death of a woman born in 1962. The Zaporozhye region on June 18 and 19, in the settlements of Vasilievka and Pervomaiska, Ukrainian drones attacked civilian cars, injuring 2 people. On June 20, the AFU targeted private houses in Grozovo and Konstantinovka with UAVs, and again 2 people were injured. On June 22, in Vasilievka, a drone hit an apartment building, injuring a man born in 1965. Kherson region on June 18, in the villages of Kara and Vinogradova, 4 civilians were injured in the Ukrainian drone raid. On June 22, the AFU shelled the village of Novaya Zbryovka from tube artillery, injuring 2 local residents. In the village of Kazachye Lagira, 1 person was killed by artillery shelling, 2 people were injured in the shelling of the village of Kalinovka. In the DPR on June 20, on the Svetlodarsk-Mironovsky highway, the head of the Mironovsky production complex, Voda Donbass, was killed as a result of a suicide drone attack on company vehicle. 3 other employees of the enterprise were injured. On June 21, the AFU shelled the residential sector of Gorlovka with large-caliber artillery. A woman born in 1996 was wounded. The LPR on June 16, in Kremenai, 2 teenagers aged 16 and 17 were killed as a result of an AFU drone strike on private sector. And it makes your blood go cold as you talk about this. On June 18, in the city of Rubezhny, a man born in 1951 was killed in an UAV attack. On June 20, in Lysychansk, the AFU hit an ambulance with a UAV. A paramedic was seriously wounded, and a nurse and the driver received shrapnel wounds. The next day, in the same city, artillery shelling by the AFU led to the hospitalization of a girl born in 2020 with a mine blast injury. But all of these AFU fighters will be punished. Russian courts continue to pass sentences on Ukrainian neo-Nazis and mercenaries for their military and other crimes. According to the Investigative Committee of Russia, since 2014, more than 7,300 criminal cases have been initiated concerning the crimes of the Kiev regime, including against representatives of the leadership and security forces of Ukraine, as well as members of radical nationalist associations. To date, investigations have been completed in relation to 637 individuals, and 577 defendants have received guilty verdicts. The Investigative Committee of Russia has identified AFU commanders who supervised the illegal movement of civilians from the Kursk region. They were AFU officials, Military Commandant Major General Eduard Moskalev and press officer of the Commandant's Office, Colonel Alexei Dmitryshkovsky. They are suspected of committing crimes under articles on terrorism and hostage-taking. According to the investigation, under their command, Ukrainian security forces captured civilians as hostages in Sudzha and then took them out of Russia and illegally held them until May of this year in the Sumy region. AFU militants Kraivanov, 14 years in prison, Valaklitskaya, Shevchenko, 15 years each, Borisov, Dudnik, Katenyuk, Titenko, 16 years each, and Petokhov, 17 years. They all were convicted for crimes in the Kursk region. They will spend most of their sentences in maximum security penal colonies. In absentia, sentences were handed down to legionnaires from Belgium, Martin Jacques, and from Georgia, David Kotelashvili. They were sentenced to 14 years in prison each.
Also, we paid attention to the messages in Iranian mass media related to the atrocities of the terrorist Kiev regime. On June 22, together with the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, 3 agents of the military intelligence were detained. They were trying to infiltrate the drone facility in Isfahan. However, they were detained before the drone was activated. They were sentenced to execution by hanging. The verdict will be implemented within 2 weeks. This all reaffirms to the terrorist nature of the Kiev regime. In their terrorist actions, they do not restrict themselves to the territory of the Russian Federation. They also perpetrate perpetrate terrorist attacks in other regions of the world. We all remember what they are doing on the African continent. However, they are fighting not only individuals, they are fighting the culture. The fight against the Russian language and the Russian-speaking population in Ukraine is going to another level. They are they are looking for their victims on the streets, and they start persecution. Some begin to earn popularity in this subject. A blogger and a footballer opposed a football player, Yevgeny Seleznov, for speaking Russian when playing football. And what if all bloggers and all the likes of them opposed Zelensky, who speaks Russian everywhere at work and at home, if one can qualify his terrorist activities as work? He filmed all of this and published all of this on social media, perhaps trying to get more followers and more likes. However, neither the management of the football club, neither the followers appreciated this provocative content. The blogger was hired, and many of his subscribers disagreed with him. Yevgeny Seleznov continued to play. And the most interesting thing is that, in the end, the young blogger admitted that he himself speaks Russian in everyday life and uses Ukrainian only in public. And the MoFa, the Ukrainian language activists, also targeted an athlete, the gymnast Vlada Nikolchenko. She refused to give up communicating in her native Russian language. On social media, she was shamed, she was wished death, and everyone called for her to be expelled from the country. These activists also got to the legendary football coach of the USSR national team and Dynamo Kiev, Valery Lobanovsky, who passed away more than 20 years ago. But Ukraine, this embarrasses no one in Ukraine, and he was accused of the conscious and systematic formation of a Russian-speaking environment, demonstrating contempt for the Ukrainian language and obstructing Ukrainization in the 1990s. As a proof of Lobanovsky's alleged guilt, a quote from the newspaper Soviet Sport is cited, where the coach criticizes those who raise the language issue in Kiev and declares that the Ukrainian language has never been oppressed. And only for this, now, after he passed away, he is being shamed by them. The neo-Nazis are furiously demanding the demolition of the monument to Lobanovsky. What can we add here? They are revealing their nature and their essence in themselves. All these savage manifestations of intolerance for any healthy society have become possible due to the primitive Russophobia being implanted at the state level. The Ukrainian citizens are indoctrinated that Russia and Russians are their main enemies in a country where, before the neo-Nazis came to power, different nationalities coexisted peacefully. Society is now being artificially polarized, and hatred is being sown against the so-called wrong citizens. All sporting and other achievements for the glory of the states are nullified if you don't speak the right language. It gets to the point where ideologically processed and indoctrinated people demand that Russian-speaking population should be barred from the bomb shelters, because you see, they are irritated and annoyed by the Russian-speaking population. Perhaps if they are sprinkled with the holy water, it would annoy them as well. All these facts confirm the relevance of the special military operation for the denazification and demilitarization of Ukraine and the elimination of threats emanating from its territory. All its goals will be achieved. It is not about Ukraine. On January the 17th, the report of the UN Secretary General was circulated on children in armed conflicts, According to the estimates of the Secretariat of the World Organization, 2024 was marked by a significant increase in the number of serious violations against children. A separate place in the document is given to the situation of children in the context of the Ukrainian crisis. For the past year, UN representatives have somehow calculated a sharp increase in the number of cases of murder and maiming of children. For the third year in a row, the Russian Federation has been included by the Secretariat in the list of parties allegedly responsible for such violations in Ukraine. In the vast majority of cases, the Russian armed forces and affiliated armed groups are absolutely unjustifiably burdened with virtually all responsibility for refusing to provide humanitarian access, attacks on schools and hospitals, killings, injuries, and even the recruitment of children. Where is the evidence? There is none of them. Against the backdrop of the frankly anti-Russian bias of the Ukrainian section of the report, the absence of the Ukrainian armed forces on the blacklist is extremely outrageous. Moreover, UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres manages to praise the Kyiv regime for its cooperation with the World Organization. The influence on the situation of children in the context of the criminal Kyiv regime Kursk misadventure, as well as the raids of Ukrainian militants in the Russian border areas, cause only concern for the Secretary-General. We strongly condemn the biased political decision of the UN Secretariat to include the armed forces of Russia in the list of those responsible for violations against children in Ukraine, and we see this as nothing but the manifestation of the policy of double standards that has been in place since the anti-constitutional coup d'etat in Kyiv in 2014. It has become a common practice for this organization to consistently hush up the flagrant violations by the Kyiv regime of the basic norms of international humanitarian law and all other provisions of humanitarian law. We have to state that this UN Secretariat has once again failed to thoroughly verify the data for the documents they present to the UN member states. This is of particular importance in the context of the scale of the anti-Russian information campaign launched by the West. In turn, we regularly transmit to the Office of the Special Representative of the UN Secretary-General for Children and Armed Conflict up-to-date data on the situation of children in Ukraine, in DPR, LPR, Kherson and Zaporozhye regions. Such cases are recorded and verified by us on a regular basis and must be reflected in the reports of the UN Secretariat. The Russian Federation is invariably committed to protecting children in armed conflicts, and we will continue to take systematic measures to minimize casualties among the civilian population during the special military operation. As a permanent member of the UN Security Council, we will continue to actively participate in the development and adoption of effective Council decisions on the protection of children in armed conflicts, including within its relevant working group. And of course, there are some news from behind the looking glass. The Council of Europe signed with top officials of the Kyiv regime the Special Tribunal on crimes of aggression against Ukraine. On this occasion, President Zelensky visited Strasbourg and spoke at the Parliamentary Assembly of the mentioned organization. As is well known, the Council of Europe was one of the first to advocate for the formation of quasi-judicial mechanisms against our country. Initially, the radically minded Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, which has long since turned into a stronghold of Western Russophobia and double standards, and now its destructive ideas about creating a special tribunal and, in fact, a Calgary court have received the support of the Committee of Ministers, which on June the 24th of this year empowered the Secretary-General of the Council of Europe to formalize a cynical deal with the leader of this neo-Nazi junta. The Western politicians, in fact, opened another shameful page in the history of the Council of Europe, a regional structure that vainly claims a special role in the protection of democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. They know nothing of what human rights is about. are about, if they do not see and if they never cared about the situation of the Russian-speaking population, the persecution the Kiev regime has been involved into against those who are willing to know their own language and to speak their native language, those who are willing to remember their history, and those who want to pass on to future generations the results of their achievements, of their creative efforts, of their culture. Never, on no occasion, they made no report. They made no statement. We have repeatedly stated our principled position. The Council of Europe is not empowered to either establish criminal courts or determine the existence of an act of aggression, and it does not have the corresponding authority. However, Strasbourg, it seems, does not see it fit to go into details. They can create something, they can make up something. The paper will tolerate it all. And for the sake of the speedy launch of the pseudo-legal special tribunal, the Council of Europe bureaucracy is ready to embed on legal norms and standards to trample on the international law, and at the same time, it seeks to succeed in continuing Russia through the escalation of the Ukrainian crisis. On a purely technical level, the self-proclaimed special tribunal, it is a very important point, is conceived as a Ukrainian court with an international element. What is this about? I believe that one can write a thesis about this matter, and this means that it will have no international legitimacy, and its powers, its mandate to bring charges against Russian citizens will be no broader than those of ordinary courts in Ukraine. Despite all attempts, the masterminds of this tribunal have not been able to achieve agreement on anything more, even from the European states, and the current signing of the agreement does not yet lead to the real creation of a tribunal. Before that, according to the laws of European bureaucracy, there are still many stages to go. One way or another, the work and decisions of this body will be null and void for us. We will regard the accession of any state to it as a hostile démarche, reflecting a desire not for settlement but for the aggravation of the current crisis around Ukraine. With respect to such instruments of the ordered justice, restrictive measures provided for in the legislation of the Russian Federation will be taken. The actions of its most ardent enthusiasts will also be given a criminal legal assessment. We expect that all sensible states will continue to distance themselves from the adventurous schemes of today's Council of Europe. We received many questions regarding the NATO Summit. I would like to draw your attention to the fact that today, Foreign Minister of Russia, Sergei Lavrov, made a detailed comment on this. To sum up all the questions that we received, we can say that the latest NATO Summit in The Hague on June 24-25 clearly did not live up to the hopes placed on it by the Kiev regime. And despite the numerous threats to the alliance, the summit was organized in line with the plan of Washington without taking into account the opinion of all the others. However, Washington achieved their own goals without giving consideration to the will of the others. No matter how hard they tried to camouflage it, this step was so painful for many U.S. allies that the contradictions surrounding the new ceilings spilled out into the public. Spain was the first to declare the impossibility of overheating the state budget in this way, and a number of other countries also commented in the corridors that they would not be able to meet the new target. At the same time, all member states of the bloc signed on to this commitment. How can this be? The justification for such a sharp increase in military spending in the program of radical rearmament of the North Atlantic Alliance is, of course, explained by their favorite pretext, the long-term Russian threat. To fuel the panic, the NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte once again stated that Russia could attack the bloc's countries in the next 3, 5, or maybe 7 years. I have a question in this regard. They cannot determine the clear timeline, or you are trying to tell everyone that further the stakes will be risen and more funds, more money will be required. When asked on what basis he draws such conclusions, and in fact, what reasons Russia might have to attack NATO, he was unable to answer, and these questions were asked. He referred to the fact that our country, he said, is restoring its strength. This vilifying image of Russia painted by the NATO has apparently turned out to be the most successful find for the alliance in recent decades. It seems that only with the help of the invented Russian threat can they explain to the common people another depletion of their pockets. But we understand that this all is done primarily to please the United States and convince them, and convince it that Europe is paying its share. This is a business project of Washington aimed at providing the American military-industrial complex with long-term orders at the expense of the Europeans. In this regard, NATO intends to increase defense spending and accelerate military production over the course of 10 years until 2035. The question arises in this regard, how is this then connected to the Russian threat, which is supposed to materialize in 3 years, or 5 years, or 7 years? After all, the passions at the summit were running so high as if Russian troops were already at the gates. This scaremongering was ramped up. Either Russia is about to cut off the Suwalki corridor, or landing on Bornholm will be carried out. They discussed a good number of issues. They intimidated and scared each other. But there is only one truth about this. The United States is willing to provide for its military and industrial complex with orders, and they need funds. How can they raise funds? They can raise funds from those they doomed to the economic failure and added more percent and added more burden on them, but they cannot put it clearly. Why cannot they? The voters would make a different choice in this case. By the way, in 2024 alone, the total military budget of the North Atlantic bloc countries amounted to about $1.5 trillion, more than all the countries of the world combined. And they are afraid, nonetheless. A question begs itself. If you have military budgets in the Western Europe, and you cannot implement it effectively, or you have this kind of arms that you cannot. On the other hand, well, yes, the lauded German equipment faced a very doomed fate, and German tanks are demonstrated in Russian citizens as a military trophy. Why are they speaking about the defense nature of their activities? If they spend on their military needs more than the whole world, who are they defending from? During the summit, the NATO members failed to achieve agreement on many issues, including Ukraine. They are not going to abandon the support of the Kiev regime. This year, they have already promised to allocate more than 35 billion euros this year to assist the Kiev regime. They will continue to do so in the future, as it is important for the collective West that the conflict they triggered in this region continues. The goal of NATO is to keep Ukraine in the fight today in order to guarantee a lasting peace tomorrow. If by peace they mean the so-called death silence in Ukraine, perhaps so we can agree to this. but they should call things by their own names. Everything NATO is doing is killing Ukraine. We cannot even speak about peace in this regard with these projects and these appetites. Speaking about other promises to Ukraine, the Alliance's Secretary General assured that the absence of a reference in the summit's final declaration to Kyiv's future membership in NATO means nothing, according to Ruto. According to him, quote, Ukraine's path to the alliance is still irreversible. A fantastic statement to make.
Overall, the summit in The Hague consolidated the return of the North Atlantic Alliance to its origins, to the regional meaning of its existence. Once again, as in the era of the Cold War, it is opposition to our country specifically. As the summit's declaration emphasized this, they must defend the billion of our citizens. This is a quote from the NATO declaration. This is supposedly the same golden billion whose superiority the collective West is so zealously trying to supposedly preserve. I would also like to make a comment on the statement of the Norwegian authorities. That's something unfathomable, as if everything was put from head to toes. High-ranking Norwegian representatives always keep doing this, but what they did now is unbelievable. They keep saying that Russia supposedly creates threats or risks, and along with the military, hybrid, digital, disinformation and other supposed actions by Russia, Oslo now imputes to us, you will laugh at this, direct strikes on Ukraine's energy facilities, nuclear energy facilities in particular. I would like to ask the Norwegian leadership, perhaps someone can't aware and they can't simply turn on their TV sets, perhaps they don't get the news via the internet, perhaps their radios are being jammed in Norway. Do they not have the slightest idea who exactly was hitting the nuclear sites? It was Israel and the US who were hitting nuclear sites in Iran. What does this have to do with Russia? Why are you making up something that doesn't exist? This is absolute and shameful fact to say that Russia was hitting the nuclear energy sites. The conclusion was reached in particular by the Norwegian Foreign Minister Espen Barth Eide, who at the same time declared Oslo's, I quote, firm intention to contribute to a secure energy supply and the prevention of nuclear accidents. Where? In Iran? No. He said, in Ukraine. This is unfathomable. This is absurd. Oslo's desire to prevent a nuclear accident on the territory of Ukraine is perhaps theoretically understandable, but this has nothing to do with the practice. The Russian Federation is even more interested in this, as unlike Kiev, we conduct a responsible policy in the field of atomic energy. We actively cooperate with the IAEA on the issues of nuclear safety and security, including in Ukraine. At the same time, the AFU regularly creates threats to the safety of nuclear facilities, in particular the Zaporozhye and Kursk NPPs. The Norwegian authorities turn a blind eye to these facts. If they ignored the US and Israeli strikes on the Iranian nuclear civilian infrastructure, there is no room for further discussion at all. This once again convinces us that in their conclusions about the sources of the relevant risk, the Norwegian officials are guided not by the interests of nuclear and radiation safety, but rather by the Russophobia, which dictates that they unreservedly place responsibility for all the risks on our country alone and turn a blind eye to the real sources of such risks. And by the way, here I should point out that Oslo is being consistent. No decisive condemnations of Israel's and US strikes on nuclear facilities in Iran, including the NPP Bushehr, have been heard from the Norwegian leadership. They turned away, they turned a blind eye and didn't hear anything. In this context, we would like to note that it was precisely because of Norway that the specialized interaction between Norway and our country, as in other spheres, came to naught. Oslo
стабильности Осло предпочитает подыгрывание провокационной линии киевского режима. Мы со своей стороны будем и впредь надежно обеспечивать ядерную и радиационную безопасность на национальном уровне, всемирно содействовать укреплению международного режима безопасного использования атомной энергии. А руководству Норвегии хочется посоветовать все-таки включить телевизор. Еще одна тема. Вот тоже удивительная история. Мы ознакомились с очередной редакцией ежегодного доклада канадской службы безопасности. Разведки, конечно, тоже все последовательно пропитано русофобией из раза в раз. Ничего нового об искаженном и надуманном восприятии России канадскими разведчиками мы не увидели. Складывается ощущение, что подготовка этого документа, если говорить об оценках в отношении нашей страны, ограничивается лишь обновлением даты и все. А все остальное остается как и есть. Штампуемые по шаблону утверждения о якобы имеющих место прямая цитата, враждебных действиях России, таких как шпионаж, саботаж, вмешательство во внутренние, если мне хочется так прям вот добавить, никому не интересные канадские дела остаются голословными и вообще не выдерживают никакой критики. В контексте заявления о мнимой угрозе в канадском арктическом регионе следует подчеркнуть и напомнить, что Оттава сама отказалась от сотрудничества с нашей страной в рамках Арктического совета наряду с другими участниками этого форума. И общеизвестно, что мы осуществляем свою деятельность в Арктике в строгом соответствии с международным правом в целях обеспечения устойчивого развития этого региона и открыты к любому конструктивному, взаимоуважительному взаимодействию. И особенно, конечно, цинично звучат обвинения со стороны Оттавы в дезинформации. Я напомню, это ведь именно Канада, подавляя свободу слова и преследуя инакомыслие, вычеркнула, ну вот, например, телеканал Russia Today из сетки телевизионного вещания, ввела многочисленные санкции против российских средств массовой информации, журналистов, общественных деятелей. Это ведь именно в Канаде неолиберальные